Hi, Yardena.
Hi, Natalie. How are you?
I'm great. It's so good to be speaking with you again. Thanks for a follow up. I reached out to you because I read the article that you'd written in the foreword about your position, about the devastation that would be upon Israel if it annexed the West Bank. And I was really, really interested in your perspective. And I want to get into that. But I first want to segue there by speaking about two really provocative, for lack of a better term, pieces that have been released. The first one is by Kristof in the New York Times, an opinion piece. And then I want to talk about the Civil Commission report of Hamas on October 7th, crimes against women and children. And I want to discuss just the compare contrast of such articles and documents. So you've spent your career navigating the gap between what actually happened and then what gets published. And I want to know, when you read the Kristof piece with its allegations about trained dogs being used to sexually assault Palestinian prisoners, what was your first reaction as a journalist?
My first reaction was actually very different from what my feelings were just a couple hours later. So when I first read this piece, even when I first saw the headline, I thought I was going to be reading an article of grave seriousness and of very valid accusations, because Nicholas Kristof is a very respectable journalist who I have really admired as a journalist for much of my career. His book, Half the Sky, he has written for many years about women's rights and about sexual abuse of women and children. And reading the article, I was actually devastated by what I was reading, because at first I was thinking, oh my God, how is this happening in Israel? And how are authorities not doing something about it? But then when I got deeper into the story and I started looking back at the sources, I was like, wait a second. I'm sure that there are abuses in the prison system in Israel. I mean, there is sexual abuse in any prison system, and especially after October 7th, when so many Israelis were enraged by the sexual violence that was perpetrated, not only on October 7th, but also against captives, hostages, women, children, men in Hamas captivity in Gaza. I could imagine there were guards in the Israeli jails that wanted to perpetrate really horrible things against the prisoners, particularly the Nukba terrorists, the Hamas terrorists who had waged the attack on October 7th. But looking at the really shocking allegations in the article, it seemed as if this wasn't that. This wasn't talking about reality. This was taking accusations that have lived in really fringe corners of the internet, particularly in, Hamas corners of the internet. And we know that because these accusations of, dog rape, it's impossible to train a dog to rape a human. It's impossible for a dog to penetrate a human in the way that is described in the article. And the NGO that wrote this report that Kristof's piece is based on, it is verifiably a Hamas-connected NGO. One of the heads of their organization, when one of the leaders of Hamas was assassinated, openly mourned this man as their commander. And the specific individuals who are quoted in the piece, because many of the people are not quoted, they're anonymous. It's unclear how many of these people Kristof actually spoke to versus cases that were just plucked from the report and put into his article. But the people that he does use their names, these are Hamas members. And we know that Hamas has in its interest, and one of its priorities is to vilify, delegitimize Israel. And we know that they're willing to go to any lengths to do that, whether it's by being willing to sacrifice thousands of civilians in Gaza, to paint Israel as monstrous, whether it's by spreading propaganda. And sadly, many journalists and news organizations who many of us, including myself, have so long admired, have willingly cooperated with that Hamas campaign. And you see it not just in absurd allegations of dog rape in Kristof's article, but in his own words, he insisted, yes, Hamas perpetrated horrific sexual abuse on October 7th. And then he says, in his own words, he says, but Israel is doing the same to Palestinians day after day. You can illuminate abuses of Palestinians in Israeli jails without making the salacious claim that Israel is doing what Hamas did on October 7th, day after day, because that is absolutely false. Even if you believe at face value the accusations in Kristof's piece, they pale in comparison to what Hamas has actually done and did not just on October 7th, but to hostages in Gaza. And we know that not from a salacious, unsubstantiated piece that is very problematically sourced to organizations that are connected to Hamas or unnamed individuals. We know that because hostages have told us themselves what they went through. Their families have told us about the images they received from Hamas of their children or loved ones in captivity. And we know because the Civil Commission, the independent, non-government aligned Independent Civil Commission, which just released the results of its 2.5-year investigation, in which they poured over 10,000 images, over 1,000, I think nearly 2,000 hours of visual evidence, interviewed nearly 500 people, and poured over medical records. Like Nicholas Kristof did nothing of the sort. You know, when somebody told him I was raped by a dog, he didn't say, okay, is there like a medical report? Is there visual evidence? I mean, there are cameras inside Israeli prisons. It doesn't seem as if he even reached out to the Israeli prison system for their comment. And so it's just interesting also the timing of Kristof's report. I mean, the New York Times had been notified months in advance that the Civil Commission's report was going to be released on this date. And they offered to give them the results and to write a story about it. And the New York Times reportedly refused that offer and instead chose to run this viral, salacious, largely apparently fictitious report on the same day that the Civil Commission's report was released. And so only 24 hours later did the New York Times actually run a story about it. But it was much shorter than Kristof's piece, despite the fact that this was a 300-page report. And I haven't read the entire report, but I've read enough to know that it is filled with horrific testimonies of minors in captivity who are family members who are forced to commit sexual acts on one another. A family who was sent an image of their loved one, a man who was killed on October 7th with his genitals stuffed in his mouth. A young man who was raped, gang raped at the Nova Festival on October 7th and strangled. I mean, you don't need to make these things up. Yet apparently Nicholas Kristof was used. I don't think that he even knows. I think he actually believed the things he was being told. I don't think he would have printed his piece if he was aware that they were lies. But he became a tool for this propaganda machine. And he willingly went along with it and didn't question these really just absurd accusations, which a good journalist would have, and double checked, especially when you're making accusations like that. You can't just take somebody's word for it. You have to back it up with confirmations. And he should know that as a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist.
Yeah. So many things. First of all, when you said the 10,000 pictures and videos, just to add to that, the Civil Commission report, those were pictures that they got from Hamas.
Exactly.
I mean, if ever there was substantiation of evidence, why do you think that Nicholas Kristof didn't verify? I mean, how does a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, is it under the guise of an opinion piece? Does that give you like cover for defamation to say, I'm just opining? Like, I don't even understand how this happens. Like actually how, I heard the Israeli government is going to file a defamation suit against the New York
Mhm.
Times. Like, do they not anticipate a defamation suit on something like this?
Two things. One, this is not the first or even the second time Nicholas Kristof has had a scandal with his reporting directly resulting from his trusting sources at their word without actually confirming what they're saying. People can look up the various scandals he's been caught up with and that required the paper to apologize and issue corrections. And he's kept his job because unlike other scandals with other New York Times reporters, it wasn't as if he was making these stories up. He was swindled by sources who he believed. But it looks as if, based on this case, again, I don't think that he is aware that these people were lying to him. But clearly, he has an issue with just believing what his sources are telling him and not doing the work of a journalist of confirming and double checking and verifying their claims, whether it's with medical reports or other witnesses, and also checking your sources. If you see that the source of this report, and even in his article, he says, this is like an anti-Israel organization that produced this report, the Euromed report. But look at the other claims they have made. They have claimed that Israel is harvesting the organs of Palestinians. Like, doesn't that give you pause when you're saying, okay, if this organization is releasing reports like this, and this organization has been found to be closely tied to Hamas, essentially another arm of Hamas, then maybe I shouldn't trust their report. And the thing is, an opinion piece does not shelter you from a defamation lawsuit. So that's why the Israeli government, not just threatening to, but actually they are going to bring a defamation suit against the New York Times. The New York Times might have to think again about allowing Nicholas Kristof to publish pieces like this and to stick to opinion, because this piece was printed in the opinion section, but it's not Nicholas Kristof's opinion. He wrote this piece as if it's a reported piece that went through the same kind of fact-checking mechanisms that another piece would go through. But I should say that a lot of the New York Times articles are not going through fact-checking. I mean, I have written for the New York Times. I know that a lot of the stories that get published don't go through fact checking. And we've seen many stories in the news section of the New York Times being completely wrong, whether it was the story about the supposed Israeli bombing of the Al-Ali hospital back in October 2023, which the New York Times and not just the New York Times, but many news organizations immediately published as fact, when, of course, it turned out that it was a rocket misfired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which had not even hit the hospital, but hit outside the hospital. And there were corrections, but by then it's too late. And the fact that it was published in the opinion section, according to Nicholas Kristof, and I think this is true, it's just he's an opinion writer. So he doesn't publish pieces in the news section of the Times. All of his articles are in the opinion section because he's one of the many opinion writers for the paper.
So what is qualified as his opinion with regards to this article? What's the opinion here?
There's one opinion that I think stands out prominently, which is his opinion that if you are going to condemn Hamas for perpetrating horrific acts of sexual violence on October 7th and against the hostages in Gaza, then you should also be condemning Israel for, in his words, essentially doing what Hamas did on October 7th, but doing it every day to Palestinians. That is his own accusation, and that is absolutely going to open him up to defamation lawsuits, because if that claim is proven false, and I hope it is proven false, and I believe it will be proven false, then that is an extremely grave accusation to lobby against a government and a state. And again, I'm sure that there are cases of sexual abuse in Israeli prisons, as there are cases of sexual abuse in American prisons. But this idea that it is systematic, that is happening day in and day out, or that Israel is training dogs to assist in these rapes, because the dog rape is getting the most attention here because it's just the most ludicrous accusations. But in the article, there are other accusations of, a woman being raped repeatedly, men being not raped by men, but with objects. And so, these accusations can be investigated.
Do you think Nicholas Kristof was aware of this civil commission report coming out? Like, do you think is it a coincidence that they were back to back? Was he trying to pad what was about to come out? Is he going to respond to the 300-page civil commission report? What happens next? Because I do want to talk about this civil commission that I had the honor of interviewing Kochav Eliakam, who was the head of the civil commission, and just what went into this. Again, what was it? It was 400 testimonies, 10,000 pictures, over 300 pages. I mean, they were a commission poring laboriously over this documentation and didn't rush to put it out until it was verified, complete, buttoned up. So what does the world of journalism do with a report like that? I mean, to me, that like a journalist would dig their teeth into it in excitement because there's so much to report. What happens? What New York Times, what do they do with this?
So I don't believe that Nicholas Kristof is the one who decided on the timing. I doubt he was aware that the Civil Commission's report was coming out that day. And I doubt he was aware that the Times had turned down the opportunity to cover it or have an advance copy of it and write a really in-depth piece about it. What I do believe, and I have no evidence of this, but the fact of the timing makes it impossible to think otherwise. I am sure that Euromed and the other Hamas affiliated activists that helped Nicholas Kristof find these people to interview and gave him these interviews and gave him these stories and these allegations, they had to know. They must have known, because it is no coincidence that this article came out right before to distract people from the actual factual evidence of horrific, systematic sexual violence perpetrated by not only Hamas, but other Palestinians on October 7th and afterwards. And it is really, really telling when you look at the kinds of articles that are published about Israel and how problematic the sourcing is and how many of the claims are unverified or tied to anonymous sources or sources who are absolutely connected to or members of Hamas. These are the kinds of standards that the New York Times does not employ for any other country or people. Suddenly, when it's an accusation against Jews or Israel, the standards just disappear. And suddenly it's just, okay, you have a story about dogs raping you? I'll print that. I won't go through the hoops that I go through for other stories that come my way to verify that it is actually true. And, you see that in the way that Israeli accusations are framed as, according to Israel, or Israel claims this. But when it's, a Palestinian accusing Israel of doing something, it's reported as fact. Or the person who is telling you is made to be such a sympathetic character that you are encouraged by the writer to believe them. Whereas when it's an Israeli claim, the opposite is done, to kind of make those claims seem as suspect as possible.
Why? Is this anti-Semitism at its finest? What is this? Why would Nicholas Kristof want to associate with Hamas?
So I'm not sure it's specifically anti-Semitism so much as part of a very multi-pronged campaign to, one, delegitimize, demonize Israel and encourage Americans to want their government to cease its alliance with Israel. I mean, you see that in Kristof's language in the piece. He says, around the world, prisons are places where sexual abuse happens. But in Israel's case, we are supporting that because we fund Israel. And so we are complicit. And so, that's one element of it. I think there is very much a global effort to disconnect Jews from Israel and disconnect Judaism from Israel. You see it in other stories that the New York Times has published, like the book review they did of, I think her name is Molly Crabapple, who wrote this book about the Bund and what Judaism could have looked like without Zionism, completely ignoring the fact that the Bund was a failure because of anti-Semitism and that Zionism actually saved the Jews of Europe. Had they not been Zionists, they would have all died because the only place that they were able to go at the time was to the land of Israel. And, it's really interesting how the New York Times has really tokenized and disproportionately elevated and exaggerated the anti-Zionist or anti-Israel wing of the Jewish community, when in reality, it's a very small minority of the Jewish community around the world. Most Jews are, maybe they won't call themselves Zionists because the term Zionist has just been completely redefined. But according to polls in Canada and the US and other countries, around 90% of Jews, wherever they are, feel connected to Israel, feel that it is important for Israel to remain a Jewish state. That is Zionism. And yet the New York Times has given so much attention, so much focus on the anti-Israel sect of the Jewish community that somebody who's not Jewish might come away thinking, many Jews are now just disgusted by Israel and want nothing to do with Israel. And I think all of these stories are really just parts of that campaign to break the connection between Jews and Israel. And even before October 7th, you could see how news organizations, and I saw it myself reporting for leading news organizations for over a decade from Israel. I was reporting on Israel from Israel for places like the New York Times, Time Magazine, Foreign Policy, USA Today, and many others. And I saw how stories that didn't fit their narrative, which is, that Israel is the bad guy, the Palestinians are the good guy, and that is the only thing that can be true. There's no middle ground, there's no nuance, there's no gray zone. Any stories that complicated that narrative, they weren't interested in. So stories where, for example, when I wanted to write about the Palestinian pay to slay program, in which the Palestinian Authority literally incentivizes terrorism by having a welfare system that's not based on socioeconomics, but based on prison sentences. And so if someone is sentenced to life in prison or someone is sentenced to just 5 years in prison, the one who's sentenced to life is going to get more money. He is going to get more money than the person who gets the lighter sentence. And families of martyrs, so people who are killed while carrying out attacks or in violent confrontations with Israeli forces, their families are going to be compensated. None of my editors were ever interested in those stories. I pitched many stories about the Palestinian education system. One editor was interested, and I'm thankful that I was able to write that story for Foreign Policy. It was published in 2021. It was about what is essentially child abuse in the Palestinian education system because, and this is widespread, and this is from elementary school to high school, children are taught to aspire to become martyrs. Children are taught that the heroes of their people are terrorists, like the woman who committed the 1974 massacre of children on a highway in Israel. Children showed me these textbooks in which these people are glorified, and their math problems are just really, it sounds like a joke, but it's actually true. They're being taught to add and subtract with, stones thrown at Israeli soldiers or shots fired by Israeli soldiers. No child should be learning math this way. My editors weren't interested in those stories, but any story in which Israel was doing something wrong, they were always interested in those stories. And looking back, I don't regret anything I did because I was never writing stories that were not true. And I was always trying to make sure in my stories, and I think I did in the stories I wrote, make sure that there was complexity and nuance and context for these things. But as a journalist, if you're working for a news organization or just writing for a news organization, you don't really make those decisions about what stories get printed and even what headlines get printed with your stories. It's these editors, these gatekeepers. And I think over time, those editors have ceased to be true journalists, true arbiters of truth. What they see themselves as responsible for is not for truth, but deciding which truth, which facts get reported. And if those facts help their side, which is clearly the Palestinian side, they're happy to print those reports and those stories like the Kristof piece. If those facts hurt their cause, which the Civil Commission's report certainly hurts the cause of Hamas, then they're less eager to publish those stories. And I think that's why you have it that Kristof's highly problematic piece appeared, front page. It got 2 news alerts. Like I get the New York Times news alerts. It didn't just get 1 news alert. It wanted to make sure everybody read that piece. So there were 2. There was 1, I think, in the morning and 1 later in the day. And, the Civil Commission report, again, it was a short piece compared to the Kristof piece. And it was 24 hours after the report was published. It didn't receive the kind of attention it should have received on the Times homepage. And I think that's why, because it doesn't help the cause that they have hung their flag on, which is the Palestinian cause.
Additionally, the organizations like B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence, who, it's my understanding, they're Israeli organizations that were built by Israelis with legitimate grievances and concerns for the purposes of wanting Israel to be better.
Exactly.
Are now being tokenized by, the Kristofs of the world, who are not saying, you see, these are organizations that want Israel to live up to its democratic values, but there are these international anti-Israel organizations that are not saying Israel do better. It's Israel go away. And how do these Israeli organizations allow themselves to be tokenized in this way?
NGOs need funding. And in the beginning, as you said, these organizations like B'Tselem, like Breaking the Silence, they were established with the best intent possible, bettering Israeli society, educating Israelis about what was happening in the territories in the West Bank and Gaza, educating Israelis about what was happening in prisons, these things that are very important, especially if you're a liberal Israeli like I am. You want to be made aware of any kind of harm that we are inflicting on people, and that should stop.
Right.
But very quickly, over the years, these organizations became co-opted and weaponized against Israel, not in order to make it a better place, but to aid in that campaign of delegitimizing Israel, of chipping away at global support for Israel, including support among Jews for Israel. And you can see that in the fact that the same countries that are funding organizations like Euromed, the one who made that report that Kristof bases his piece on, the same countries that are funding, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, so many organizations that have essentially become, not human rights organizations, but partners of Hamas in spreading propaganda and disinformation. These are the same countries that are now overwhelmingly funding these organizations, these Israeli organizations like B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence. And so when you are an organization that wants to continue to do the work you're doing, wants to continue to exist, you need funding. And if that's where your funding is coming from, you are going to do what those funders want you to do, which is to continue to produce reports that shine a light on the most horrible of abuses. And I'm not saying that the things that B'Tselem or Breaking the Silence is finding in its research is wrong, but the way it is being exploited and used against Israel, that is the problem. It's really sad because there aren't really Israeli human rights organizations that haven't been weaponized against Israel in this delegitimization campaign. And Israel really does need human rights organizations and defenders. And so it's really only hurting the people that need to be helped by these organizations, because when everything is seen as part of this delegitimization campaign, it makes Israelis less open to really looking inward and saying, okay, well, how can we change this? How can we stamp out this abuse? And I think that the greatest tragedy of Kristof's piece is that there could have been a piece that really looked in a serious, unsalacious, verified, responsible way at actual cases of rape or abuse in the Israeli prison system. And the fact that he made it something entirely different, essentially from the world of conspiracy theories, now there's just going to be less willingness on the part of Israeli authorities and less willingness on the part of Israelis to call for any kind of real investigation. Because if you do, then you're essentially validating this article and, the awareness it has raised to the problem of abuse in the Israeli prison system.
Which just gives more power to like the Ben Gvirs and the Smotriches, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that is why Ben Gvir has gotten so much more popular in Israel. I mean, in 2019, before Netanyahu made the disastrous decision to merge Ben Gvir's Jewish Power Party, Otzma Yehudit, with the religious Zionist party of Smotrich. Before that merger, the Otzma Yehudit party, Ben Gvir's party, was not even going to enter Knesset because it wasn't going to pass the electoral threshold to enter Knesset. That threshold is just 3%. He was only supposed to get 1% of the vote. And because of that, that was why Netanyahu wanted to make sure that didn't happen. And that's why he orchestrated that merger so that he would have the coalition he would need to form a government, because he relied on the far-right parties and the ultra-Orthodox. And only because of that merger, the Jewish Power Party and Itamar Ben-Gvir were able to enter the government. And now, 7 years later, of course, after the impact of October 7th and hardening and turning Israelis rightward, polls project him getting something like 8 or 9 seats in Knesset. And, the extremists on both sides help each other.
Exactly. Everything you've written about with your expertise on terrorism, jihadism, your book, The 1929 Hebron Massacre that ignited the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, your on-the-ground reporting, you reported from the West Bank, from Jerusalem. You have all the credibility in the world to understand like what's at stake on the land itself and understand what is in Israel's best interest. So tell me what your feelings are with regards to the West Bank and what Israel should be doing with regards to this land.
I think that it is a stain on Israel and all of us who love Israel that the attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, on innocent Palestinians in the West Bank by Jewish extremists, that the government is not doing anything to stop it. And that there is essentially silence from much of the collective Jewish community in the face of that violence and the impunity with which this violence is taking place. And I understand why there is that silence. And again, here you have the case where the far left or the extremists like Hamas are only making things worse, because it is because of that delegitimization campaign that so many Jews fear speaking out and shining a light on anything wrong, anything Israel is doing wrong, because then that just feeds the beast and it feeds that vilification of Israel. So I get that. But there is no excuse for the Israeli government to allow the attacks that are taking place on an almost daily basis on Palestinians in the West Bank. And these aren't, counter-terror attacks. These are attacks in the day, in the night, on Palestinian women, children, unarmed people who are simply trying to live their lives. And they're being attacked by Jewish extremists who believe and openly state their cause. Their cause is to cleanse Judea and Samaria, the biblical name for the West Bank, of Palestinians, of Arabs. And they believe in a messianic vision in which the redemption of Israel, or the messianic era, can emerge only when all of Judea and Samaria, or all of ancient Israel, is Jewish. This is what they believe, and this is an absolute fringe of Israeli society and a fringe of the settlement community. I mean, there are over 500,000 settlers. The vast, overwhelming majority of them are peaceful people. It is a small segment of the settlement population that is violent, but because these attacks are happening with zero accountability, absolute impunity, it doesn't really matter. that it's such a small segment of Israeli society or of the settlement movement that is perpetrating them. Because if the government is doing nothing about it, that sends the message that these people have the support of the government. And sadly, they do have the support of the government, because the government today is led not just by Netanyahu, but by Ben Gvir and by Smotrich, who have such a disproportionate amount of power in the government. And they are from that same movement, that Jewish extremist movement, which believes that the West Bank should only be Jewish and that Israel should annex the West Bank. And over the course of the last year or so, government has been taking various measures and various steps that point to an effort to annex the West Bank. Not officially, not formally, not to declare Israel is annexing the West Bank, but to do it, creating facts on the ground, kind of the way the settlement movement emerged, just slowly passing laws that make it easier for Israel to seize, for example, land that was designated for the Palestinian Authority in the Oslo agreements, or by declaring massive amounts of land, state land, where Palestinians can't build homes or can't live. So many measures have been passed in the last year that international organizations have said that Israel is essentially carrying out de facto annexation, unofficial annexation. Mm-hmm. And these ministers have not denied that. They've actually, in their own words, called this, Israel taking, matters into their own hands and instituting de facto sovereignty. They don't use the word annexation, they use the word sovereignty, mm-hmm. which is essentially their way of saying, this is how we are going to take control of this land. And Smotrich has said that this is how we are going to kill the idea of a two-state solution. It's interesting because I feel like there has been a lot of silence around these efforts in the diaspora and even in Israel. There aren't people sounding the alarms like, wait a second, we can't annex the West Bank. If we annex the West Bank, that means that 3 million Palestinians will now become residents of the state of Israel. And those 3 million Palestinians won't be given the rights of citizens. I mean, I can't see the most far-right government in Israeli history giving 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank the right to vote. And so when you have Israel annexing an area as large as the West Bank, inhabited by 3 million Palestinians without giving them the rights of citizenship, you're essentially giving the green light to a word that many of us reject when Israel is described that way, and that word is apartheid. If suddenly you have the Jewish state no longer a Jewish majority, and this is what the founders of Israel said, we are not just going to be a Jewish state, we're going to be a democratic state, and we're going to be a Jewish majority state. If the Jewish state is no longer a Jewish majority, and it's no longer democracy because half of its people don't have the rights that the other half have, what is it? It's not Jewish. It's not democratic. That's not an Israel that I want to be fighting for. And I think that's an Israel that a lot of Jews in the diaspora and in Israel will not want to be a part of. And that's what scares me most about these efforts, because once you go that direction, it's really hard to go back.
Let me ask you though, I mean, even if it's a few Palestinian terrorists, even if we can agree that it's, the majority want to coexist, but the damage that is inflicted by not just a handful, but many, many violent Palestinians who want to come and commit atrocities in Israel beyond the West Bank, like how do you account for that if there is not Israeli law governing and military law making sure that Israeli citizens are safe?
My ideal, I think like many people's ideals, is for Israelis and Palestinians to be able to live in peace side by side. I don't think that we should be living together. I don't think that the last 78 years have shown that we're capable of sharing the land and living side by side. And I don't think that we have seen anything but more wars from this perpetuating. I do believe that a two-state solution is the only solution that will provide any kind of hope for real peace, because I believe that if Jews deserve self-determination in our homeland, Palestinians also deserve self-determination in their land. But I reject the idea that it is Israel's responsibility for them not having a state. Their leaders have rejected every two-state solution based on the research I did for my book, I feel more sure that the way forward is a two-state solution, but that the way forward to achieving a two-state solution is something that has never been tried. And that's not just forcing the two sides together and to agree to a two-state solution. That's what has always been tried. And the reason it has always failed is because Palestinian leadership has always rejected those offers. What's really necessary is for change to happen from the ground up in Palestinian society, for a different kind of Palestinian leadership to emerge that does want peace, that does believe in two states for two peoples, and that is willing, and not just willing, but wants to change, wants to reform things like pay to slay, wants to have a welfare program that, is based on socioeconomics, wants to have an education system that teaches children peace and success and the kinds of skills children are taught everywhere and not taught to aspire to become martyrs. And, of course, that's going to take years. And when I say I believe a two-state solution is the solution, I'm not saying tomorrow or next year, even 5 years from now. I think it's going to take a long time. But I don't think it helps anyone for us to just say, no, we're just always going to, it's always going to be like this. And, it's been like this in the past, so that's how it's going to be in the future. No, we need to learn from the mistakes of the past. We need to learn from the lessons of history that show us how we got here and also how we can find our way out. And so, no, I don't think that the answer is continued military rule. Yes, for now, until we can see a real movement on the Palestinian side for change and for peace and for reconciliation. But I don't think that is the ideal not for them and certainly not for us. I mean, I think Israel needs a two-state solution more than the Palestinians need a two-state solution. I mean, for us to remain a Jewish and democratic state, we need to separate. We need to have an end to this conflict. So many Israeli parents have hoped when their children are born that their children won't need to serve in the army. That's not something that parents want for their children, to have to defend their country against the neighbors next door. And so I feel as if, for generations of Israelis, the hope has been for peace and for the answer from across the table to be yes. And we can't give up on that hope. We Israelis, Jews cannot afford to give up on that hope.
In terms of like Gaza, are you looking at these as two different beasts? Because Gaza did have that, and then they perpetrated on October 7th. So that was the case. They did have their own ruling, and then they did. So then what? Because they can't rule themselves. Are you realistic in the kind of leadership that they'll ever have, or are you unrealistic? Because it sounds respectfully unrealistic.
So the West Bank cannot become Gaza. And that is why so many Israelis insist after October 7th that Israel can never leave the West Bank. And I'm not proposing that Israel leave the West Bank entirely. There are areas of Judea and Samaria, like Gush Etzion, where there is no reason for Israel to leave because these areas were always Jewish. Land was purchased by Jews, owned by Jews long before 48. And it was actually Jews who were expelled from the West Bank or from Judea and Samaria by the Jordanians in 1948 or by Palestinian Arabs in the civil war that preceded 1948. So I'm not saying that Israel should leave Judea and Samaria. I'm not saying that Israel or Israelis or Jews don't have a right to live in Judea and Samaria. Of course we do. This is the biblical heartland of the Jewish people. But speaking about what's realistic, I mean, there are 3 million Palestinians who live there. There are 500,000 or so Jews who live there. Israel just can't afford to rule over people who don't want to be ruled by it. And, when people don't want to be ruled by another people and are not given the same rights as other people, they are going to wage violent resistance. And so this is why I just believe it's really naive to think that Israel can just stay there forever and the Palestinians are just going to put up their hands and say, okay, that's not going to happen. And so I think that this idea that the West Bank is just destined to become another Gaza. That in itself is a lie. We're telling ourselves to have an easy way out. Well, okay, well, look what happened in Gaza, so we can't do it in West Bank. The way the withdrawal from Gaza was done was extremely irresponsible. I mean, it was a unilateral decision. The international community, the Palestinian leadership, it was just Israel to say, okay, we're just going to leave. We've put up our hands, we're going to leave. And it was, idealistic. It was, the thought was, okay, well, maybe if we leave here, this could be kind of a model for a two-state solution. The intentions were good, but the preparation on the ground didn't happen. And it was clear from the beginning, I mean, even before the withdrawal, it was clear that Gaza was going to be taken over by Hamas. It was clear that Hamas had more power than Fatah in Gaza. It was clear that there had not been an effort prior to the withdrawal to ensure that there would be a different kind of leadership, a different kind of government, a more moderate, peace-seeking government that would be in power in Gaza. And so, this is why you had the disaster that followed the withdrawal from Gaza. October 7th happened 17 years later, but you had 17 years prior to that of Hamas ruling over Gaza. And you had the absolute sin of Netanyahu funneling money, millions of dollars from Qatar to Hamas, money he requested be paid to Hamas because he wanted to ensure that Gaza and the West Bank would remain divided, that there wouldn't be a situation where the Palestinian Authority was ruling in the West Bank and Gaza, because then it would be more likely for a unified Palestinian governance to emerge, and it would be more likely for a two-state solution to emerge. And I mean, they've been open about this. Him and other members of his government have said that Hamas was an asset. And so we can't ignore the mistakes Israel made in leading to the situation in which Gaza ended up being such a disaster. I'm not saying that Israel is to blame for October 7th by any means. But what I'm saying is that it's not a foregone conclusion that the West Bank would become if Israel did exactly what it did in Gaza and just said, okay, we're going to leave the West Bank. Yes, of course it would become another Gaza. But I think obviously that won't happen again. But it doesn't mean that we can't still hope for and work towards a day where Palestinians and Israelis will be able to coexist side by side in two states for two people, just as the early Zionists wanted. I mean, if you read my book or other books about the early Zionist movement and pre-state Israel, they wanted not just a two-state solution, but even wanted a shared state. When the people in the pro-Palestine movement talk about how Israel shouldn't exist, it should just be, this utopian society where Arabs and Jews all have the same rights. The Jewish community of Palestine, the Zionist organization, the early Zionist movement, was all for that. It was the Arab leadership of Palestine and Arab leaders who were adamantly against being equal and sharing the land. They rejected not just offers of a state alongside a Jewish state from 1937 to 1947 to afterwards, but before 1937 and even after, there was discussion, offers from the British to create a government, a self-government of the locals, and the locals were Jews and Arabs. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews living in the land of Israel, the British Mandate of Palestine, prior to 1948. And they proposed that there would be power sharing of a government led by Jews and Arabs. And the Jews loved the idea. The Jewish leadership loved the idea. And it was the Arab leadership who said, no, we'll self-govern if it's the Arabs who are in charge because we're the majority. I don't think it's anti-Israel or anti-Zionist to say that we still believe in the necessity or the possibility of a two-state solution. And I think to think that is to kind of condemn us to another century of wars and massacres, and I'm not willing to lose that hope.
Thanks for listening. For more, you can visit Instagram at Grace for Impact Podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please follow the show, leave a rating and review. See you next time.